Flight 421 was unusually quiet that evening. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, accompanied by the soft murmur of passengers settling into their seats. Among them sat a boy no older than 12, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the clouds drift past like distant islands in a silver sea. He seemed ordinary enough, unassuming, polite, quiet. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he clutched a worn leather notebook tightly to his chest, as if it were a treasure he could not let go of. The flight attendants had noticed him early on. Unlike other children who ran up and down the aisles or fidgeted restlessly, he stayed in his seat, reading occasionally, jotting notes, or simply staring out the window in contemplative silence. He didn't cry when a baby started wailing nearby, didn't complain when the plane hit turbulence, and didn't speak unless spoken to. Some passengers admired his composure, while others merely ignored him, assuming he was just another shy kid traveling with his family. What nobody realized, not even the cabin crew, was that this boy carried a secret far bigger than his small frame suggested. Behind his calm exterior was a mind sharp as a razor and a heritage that would eventually astonish everyone aboard Flight 421. The journey had begun like any other. Families returning from vacations, business travelers with laptops open, elderly couples reading newspapers, they all settled into the familiar rhythm of flight. But as the plane ascended and leveled off, a sudden announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be experiencing light turbulence over the next hour. Please fasten your seatbelts." A few heads tilted toward the boy. He adjusted his seatbelt, but his expression remained unchanged. It was not fear or anxiety that marked his calm demeanor. It was something else, something that suggested a level of self-control and awareness uncommon for his age. One of the flight attendants, a woman named Clara, walked past him to offer drinks and snacks. "Would you like some juice, young man?" she asked politely. He looked up, his dark eyes steady and serious. "No, thank you," he said softly. His voice was measured, deliberate. Not bratty, not spoiled, not overly polite, just mature. Clara nodded and moved on, slightly puzzled by the boy's quiet intensity. Hours passed with little incident, and yet the quiet boy seemed to observe everything. He noticed the anxious businessman pacing the aisle, the elderly woman struggling with her overhead luggage, the young couple whispering nervously in the row ahead. He even noticed the subtle tension among the crew, a tension that most passengers would have overlooked. Later, as the plane cruised over a stretch of ocean where radar signals were weak, the captain made a routine announcement. "We're experiencing minor technical difficulties, but nothing to worry about. We are in constant communication with ground control and will update you shortly." The boy's eyes narrowed slightly. He was scribbling in his notebook, but he wasn't doodling. He was drawing diagrams, making calculations, noting observations that no child should have known to notice. Clara passed by again and couldn't resist a second glance. "You're very focused," she said with a smile. The boy looked up once more, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her catch her breath for a moment. "I like to understand how things work," he said simply. It wasn't until a few hours later that the first hints of the boy's true significance began to surface. The cabin had grown tense. An older passenger, a retired military officer, had struck up a conversation with the boy, intrigued by his calm demeanor. "Most kids would be panicking right now," the man said. "But you seem, well, unusually collected." The boy glanced at him and shrugged. "I like to watch and learn. Sometimes understanding the situation helps more than worrying about it." That remark, innocent as it sounded, resonated in ways that only a few would later understand. For while the passengers on Flight 421 remained unaware, the crew had been in subtle communication with authorities on the ground. The retired officer had been listening carefully and sensed something extraordinary about the boy. It was not until the final leg of the flight, as the plane began its descent into a major airport, that the revelation came. A news bulletin flashed on a crew tablet, a routine alert that a high-ranking air marshal was traveling incognito. His son, the bulletin noted, was supposed to be accompanying him. But no one had seen the air marshal, and now it became clear why this boy had been traveling alone, why he had carried himself with such poise and awareness. Passengers who had barely noticed him earlier suddenly saw him in a new light. The quiet boy, the one who had sat silently through turbulence and observed every movement aboard the plane, was not just any child. He was the son of one of the most respected figures in the country's Air Force, an air marshal whose influence, skill, and legacy were known in every military airbase. As the plane touched down safely, the boy closed his notebook, stood up, and collected his belongings. To the casual observer, he looked exactly as he had when he boarded, quiet, composed, and unassuming. But to those who had learned the truth, the realization was profound. The boy who had seemed ordinary had been extraordinary all along. Passengers whispered to one another as they disembarked. Flight attendants exchanged glances, and Clara couldn't help but marvel at the boy's calmness. The secret he carried, the legacy he represented, was now known, but it did nothing to alter his demeanor. He walked through the airport like any other child. Yet everyone who had seen him knew they had witnessed something remarkable, and so the quiet boy of Flight 421 had passed through their lives, leaving behind more than just curiosity. He had left an impression of courage, awareness, and a rare composure that hinted at the extraordinary life that lay ahead, a life shaped by the legacy of his father, the Air Marshal, and by the quiet determination that had marked him from the very beginning. The boy's name was Arjun. Though he had spent the flight in near silence, his mind had been far from idle. He had been traveling alone because his father, Air Marshal Devendra Rao, had been called for an urgent overseas assignment at the last moment. The boy's calm demeanor wasn't just natural composure. It was the result of years of disciplined upbringing under the guidance of a man who had dedicated his life to aviation, strategy, and leadership. Devendra Rao was no ordinary military officer. In his career spanning more than 3 decades, he had earned respect for his tactical brilliance, his courage under fire, and his unwavering dedication to protecting his nation's skies. He had trained hundreds of pilots, commanded squadrons in tense conflicts, and was often called upon to advise on matters that required precision, insight, and decisiveness. His son, though young, had absorbed these lessons quietly, observing his father's actions, listening to his stories, and internalizing the discipline that shaped a leader. Arjun's notebook was more than a journal. It was a compilation of notes, sketches, calculations, and observations inspired by everything his father had taught him. On this flight, he had been tracking minor irregularities in the cabin, movements, subtle gestures, and patterns that might escape the eyes of adults. It wasn't about suspicion or mistrust. It was about understanding, analyzing, and being prepared, exactly as his father had trained him to do. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain noticed the boy's calmness with a mixture of curiosity and relief. The turbulence had been heavier than expected, but while some passengers fidgeted and whispered nervously, Arjun had remained seated, unflinching. The crew began to exchange glances, wondering about the quiet boy who seemed so mature, so aware, as though he carried wisdom far beyond his years. As the plane descended toward its destination, the moment of revelation that had already begun to ripple among the passengers intensified. The tablet in the hands of the cabin crew displayed more details about Air Marshal Rao, a man whose presence alone inspired respect, caution, and sometimes awe. News flashes described his latest achievements, orchestrating complex air exercises, negotiating delicate international agreements, and commanding critical missions that had saved countless lives. Passengers began whispering, their curiosity now tinged with admiration. Some exchanged looks of disbelief. The boy they had noticed only for his quiet composure was not just any child. He was the son of a man who represented the pinnacle of leadership and bravery in the nation's Air Force. A subtle shift occurred in the cabin's atmosphere. Where anxiety had lingered during turbulence, now there was fascination, a recognition that they had shared space with someone exceptional. Arjun, however, remained oblivious to the murmurs. He had been trained not to seek attention, to remain grounded, and to observe before acting. In his mind, this was routine. His father's teachings were clear. Courage was not loud. It was measured, deliberate, and often invisible to those who did not understand. In the row ahead, a retired pilot leaned toward his wife. "Did you see that boy during the turbulence?" "He didn't flinch once," he whispered. "It's like he's Trained. His wife nodded, curiosity mixing with admiration. Yes, and now this news. His father is the air marshal? No wonder he's composed. He's inherited more than just genes. He's inherited discipline, focus, and awareness most adults lack. The boy's awareness was not limited to the plane. Arjun had been thinking ahead, considering the landing, anticipating possible delays, and mentally preparing for the arrival procedures. He made notes in his notebook about flight patterns, cabin layouts, and passenger behavior, not out of obsession, but out of a desire to understand the world around him. His father had instilled in him a sense of responsibility, a principle that one's mind should always remain active, analyzing and learning, even in moments of stillness. As the plane touched down smoothly, the captain exhaled, his confidence in the boy's quiet vigilance reinforced by the knowledge that the child had seemed unshakable, even in moments of minor turbulence. Clara, the flight attendant, watched as Arjun rose from his seat, tucking the notebook carefully under his arm. She felt a sudden pang of respect mixed with awe. This wasn't just a polite child. This was a boy who carried the legacy of one of the country's most decorated air officers, and whose very demeanor reflected it. At the baggage claim, the revelation of Arjun's father's identity continued to ripple through the crowd. Passengers who had noticed his quiet intensity exchanged glances, some murmuring congratulations, others sharing stories of children they knew, wondering if they too could inherit such poise. The boy, however, walked steadily, without pretense or pride, just as his father had taught him. He did not seek recognition for who he was, nor did he need it. His sense of identity was grounded in action and awareness, not in applause. Later, when the airport authorities arrived to escort him, there was a subtle ceremony of respect. Security personnel and staff treated him with care, acknowledging the lineage he represented, yet allowing him the dignity of independence. Arjun smiled faintly, a small nod to the lessons he had absorbed from his father. Courage was silent. Respect was earned quietly, and awareness could protect more than loud words ever could. In the evening sun, Arjun's figure disappeared into the terminal, carrying his notebook, his calm composure, and the quiet strength of a boy who already understood the weight of legacy. Passengers who had observed him would remember not just the turbulence or the ordinary flight, but the extraordinary presence of a child shaped by discipline, courage, and the unseen guidance of an air marshal father. For Arjun, this flight was a reminder the world would see him as a quiet boy, but he knew the truth. True strength was measured not by words or attention, but by calmness in adversity, awareness in chaos, and the quiet carrying of a legacy that could one day change the lives of many. The next morning, after Flight 421's uneventful landing, the story of the quiet boy on the plane began to circulate online. A few passengers had shared posts about him, a mysterious young traveler who stayed calm through turbulence and turned out to be the son of an air marshal. The posts spread fast, carried by curiosity and admiration, but for Arjun, fame was never the goal. He woke early in his hotel room, sunlight streaming through the curtains, and opened his leather notebook again. On one page, he had drawn a detailed diagram of Flight 421's cabin, every row, every door, every emergency exit. He wasn't obsessed. He was learning. He wanted to understand not just how airplanes worked, but how people behaved in confined, stressful environments. His father had always said, "Understanding behavior is as important as understanding machinery. Both can save lives." Later that day, Arjun was scheduled to board another connecting flight, a shorter one, only 2 hours. It was supposed to be simple, yet fate had other plans. The new flight, 654, took off smoothly under a clear blue sky. The crew was different, the passengers mostly business travelers. Arjun took his usual window seat, quietly observing. But 20 minutes after takeoff, an uneasy tension began to build in the cabin. A tall man in his 30s was pacing near the lavatory, looking restless. He kept glancing toward the cockpit door, muttering something under his breath. Most passengers ignored him, assuming he was nervous. But Arjun noticed patterns, the way the man's right hand stayed close to his jacket pocket, how his eyes scanned the flight attendants rather than the seat numbers. Something didn't fit. Arjun's heart rate increased slightly, but his expression remained calm.
He remembered his father's words from years ago. Fear tells you what's wrong.
Calm tells you what to do. He looked around discreetly. The nearest flight attendant, a young man named Rakesh, was serving drinks 2 rows ahead. Arjun waited until Rakesh passed close by, then spoke softly. "Sir, that man near the lavatory. He's been standing there too long. I think he's nervous, but something feels wrong." Rakesh smiled politely at first, assuming the boy was being observant. But then he saw the man's behavior himself, the twitching hand, the anxious glances. He excused himself and walked toward the back galley, whispering something into the intercom. Within minutes, subtle coordination began between the cabin crew. 2 flight attendants moved closer to the suspicious passenger, pretending to collect trash, while another discreetly informed the captain. Arjun didn't move. He simply observed, calm, silent, aware. The cabin seemed normal to most passengers, but tension was rising quietly beneath the surface. Suddenly, the man lunged forward, trying to grab the service cart to push toward the cockpit. Before he could take another step, Rakesh and another attendant intercepted him, blocking his way. A brief struggle ensued, startling passengers. Gasps filled the cabin. The boy's instincts kicked in. Without panic, he reached under his seat, retrieved a small folded blanket, and threw it toward Rakesh, who used it to disorient the man temporarily. The act was so quick and subtle that most passengers didn't even notice who had helped. The captain made an emergency announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and calm. The situation is under control." Within moments, the man was restrained using cable ties from the flight kit. The crew secured him in a rear seat while the captain contacted air traffic control. When calm returned to the cabin, Rakesh walked past Arjun, kneeling slightly. "You noticed before anyone else did," he said quietly. "You might have saved us a lot of trouble." Arjun lowered his gaze modestly. "I just remembered what my father taught me, to observe everything." By the time the flight landed safely, the news had already reached the airport authorities. A report was filed, and a quiet commendation was passed to Arjun's father through official channels. The man who had tried to cause chaos was detained and later identified as mentally unstable, not dangerous. But it could have gone differently if not for the boy's awareness. When Arjun stepped off Flight 654, reporters had already gathered near the arrival gate, holding cameras and microphones. Word had spread. The Air Marshal's son shows bravery on flight. But Arjun didn't stop for interviews. He walked calmly with the airport security officer who had come to receive him. His father's voice echoed again in his memory. Not the voice of an officer giving orders, but of a father teaching his son humility. The world doesn't need to know every time you do something good. Sometimes silence is the loudest honor. That night, in his father's study, Arjun sat quietly as Air Marshal Devendra Rao returned home after a long mission. The man's uniform still carried the scent of aviation fuel and metal, symbols of responsibility that few could understand. "I heard what happened," Devendra said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You stayed calm." "I did what you taught me," Arjun replied softly. Devendra smiled faintly. "That's what matters. But remember, son, calm is not the absence of fear. It's the control of it." He handed Arjun a small silver pin, an Air Force insignia that had belonged to Devendra when he was a young pilot. "Keep this," he said. "Not because of what you did today, but because of what you didn't do. You didn't panic, you didn't brag, you didn't lose focus." That's real courage. As Arjun looked at the pin gleaming in the soft light, he understood what his father truly meant. Bravery wasn't just about action. It was about restraint, awareness, and responsibility. He would remember that forever. Outside, as night fell over the airbase, a pair of fighter jets soared across the horizon, their afterburners tracing bright streaks in the sky. A salute to the silent courage that sometimes lives not in heroes of battle, but in quiet boys who simply remember their father's lessons at 30,000 feet. Days turned into weeks after the Flight 654 incident, but the story of the quiet boy had already spread far beyond what Arjun or his father expected. Newspapers ran headlines like "Air Marshal's son shows unshakable courage" and "The boy who stayed calm at 30,000 feet." But for Arjun, life hadn't changed much. He still woke up early, read his father's old aviation manuals, and wrote quietly in his leather notebook, not about fame, not about himself, but about what he had learned. The world, however, had changed around him. The airline had sent a formal letter of appreciation to his father, expressing gratitude for the boy's presence of mind that possibly prevented panic and helped maintain order. Reporters wanted interviews. Schools wanted him to speak to students about calmness under pressure, but the air marshal politely declined them all. "My son is not a celebrity," he said firmly to one journalist. "He's a student, learning from life, not performing for it." Yet in private, Devendra Rao could not hide his pride. He would glance at his son sometimes when Arjun was sketching or reading and think of how much the boy resembled his late wife, calm, thoughtful, and brave in quiet ways. She had been the balance in his life, and now, through Arjun, her steadiness lived on. One evening, the father and son stood on the terrace of their house near the airbase. The sky above them was painted with streaks of orange and purple, aircraft silhouettes cutting across the fading light. The air marshal spoke softly, his voice steady. "You know, Arjun," he said, "the sky is full of stories. Every flight carries people, dreams, memories, and sometimes lessons." Arjun looked up at him. "Do you think people on Flight 421 will remember me?" Devendra smiled faintly. "They might. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that you remember who you were on that flight, not because of who your father is, but because of who you chose to be." That night, as Arjun opened his notebook, he wrote those words down. Then he turned to a new page and titled it, "The Lesson of the Quiet Sky." He began to write about what he had observed, the turbulence, the anxious faces, the moment of calm before the storm. He wrote not as a hero, but as a witness to the importance of awareness and inner balance. He described how silence could be stronger than shouting, how observation could be sharper than reaction, and how a child could sometimes carry lessons that even adults forget. Months later, when his father was invited to speak at a national defense conference, something unexpected happened. At the end of his lecture on crisis management and human behavior under stress, he paused and looked at the audience, officers, cadets, and aviation experts. "I want to share something personal," he said, "a lesson I learned not from war or training, but from my son." He narrated briefly how a boy of 12 had stayed calm through turbulence, observed danger before others did, and acted with quiet precision. "Courage," he said, "is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent, analytical, and disciplined. And sometimes the bravest person in the room doesn't wear a uniform." When he finished, the hall was silent, not out of surprise, but out of respect. It was a different kind of tribute, one that didn't glorify drama or violence, but celebrated awareness and peace. Later that evening, Devendra came home to find Arjun asleep on the sofa, his notebook resting open beside him. On the latest page, the boy had drawn a simple sketch, a small airplane flying steadily through rough clouds, with a line beneath it that read, "Calm is the pilot of courage." The air marshal smiled quietly, closing the notebook.
For a man who had commanded fighter jets and led squadrons,
that one sentence meant more than all his medals. In time, Arjun's story was used in aviation safety seminars, not for hero worship, but as an example of emotional intelligence under pressure. Airlines began encouraging their crews to pay attention to the calm ones, those who noticed details, who reacted with thought instead of fear. Years later, when Arjun himself joined the Air Force Academy, he carried that same leather notebook. On the first day of training, when an instructor asked the new cadets what inspired them to join, some spoke of patriotism, others of adventure. When Arjun's turn came, he simply said, "My father taught me to stay calm. The sky taught me why it matters." His words were brief, but they carried weight. His peers didn't know the full story, the flights, the fear, the silence, but they felt the sincerity. On graduation day, Air Marshal Devendra Rao stood proudly in the audience as his son received his wings. The crowd applauded, the national anthem played, and a formation of jets roared overhead in salute. But the moment that mattered most was when father and son saluted each other, not as hero and child, but as two pilots of the same spirit. That night, under the starlit sky, Arjun opened his notebook one last time and wrote the final entry on the last page. Some stories are written in the sky, not in sound or fame, but in silence, where calm becomes courage, and courage becomes legacy. He closed the book gently, placed his father's old silver pin inside, and smiled. Far above, a jet cut across the stars, its contrail glowing faintly like a line of destiny, a reminder that sometimes the quietest passengers carry the loudest legacies.